as I was a pupil at the school. He was a couple of years behind me in chronologically. And I really appreciate your sympathy. He, having studied physics, I believe, at Manchester, he then went off and studied English at Cambridge, and that has really led to him pursuing a career not only as a published creative writer, but also as a teacher of creative writing. And he teaches in the Helen Zell program of creative writing at Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan. And it's a real honour to have him here today to talk to us. I think it's a really fitting end to a day that's been all about Philip Larkin. You know, I know a little bit, I think, about what Peter's going to be talking about. And partly it's going to be, I think, reflecting back on the events in his life that have informed his writing, and particularly events from his Coventry childhood. So I'm really excited. Well, maybe not. It's perhaps changed. That's what you told me. For about, I don't know, 5 years or something. So he might have moved on. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to introduce Peter.
You know, it's an unseasonably warm day, so I'm going to take... I was saying to my friend Richard, I should wear a jacket for this, and now I'm immediately going to take it off. But thank you, Helen, for that lovely introduction, I have to say. And thank you all for coming out on this day when we could all be enjoying the sunny weather outside and the cricket. So I appreciate you being here. And I should say especially... and this particularly to Helen, folks at the Larkin Society, as some of you know, this talk was scheduled a little bit earlier, right, a couple of weeks earlier, and it is entirely my fault that we had to reschedule, because I forgot that it was going to be my son's high school graduation in the US. You know, we don't have graduations here. I didn't have a graduation from this school when I was a pupil. So in my British brain, it didn't really track for me. I didn't imagine doing that. But, you know, it's talk about revision. So the fact that I revised the date of it seems entirely appropriate. I hope you'll agree. And as you'll see as I talk a little bit today, some of what I'm going to touch on, it talks a bit about fathers and sons in various contexts. So maybe that little shift of the date for that reason, it's thematically appropriate. Maybe, we'll find out as we go along. But I appreciate you all for making time. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from notes, so I have to... This is because I'm old now, to change the glasses. You know, one of the things I'm interested in general is taking revision, which seems like a slightly mysterious process for writers especially, and drawing it into the light, making it a little bit clearer, demystifying it just a little bit, I think, in various ways. And so I hope this will also apply not just for the writers and readers in the room, but for everybody, because I think in a certain sense, we might think of revision more capaciously as an experience we all go through in life. And I'll talk about some of the ways that happens. But actually, just that idea of fathers and sons speaks to the idea of a form of revision that we're all familiar with, I think, in various ways, which is generational revision, I think, in some form or other as well. So there are ways of extending this idea, taking it off the page and thinking about it into our own life space as we go forward as well. All right, so this talk is based on... I'll talk for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, is based a little bit on this book, The Art of Revision, that you can buy, but don't feel you have to. I feel I need to say this because I'm going to leave out lots of the book, and I won't cover everything, but now, if you want to, you can find out more about it. So the Art of Revision, and it's a talk I've given well, virtually in many places, and occasionally in person in various places across the US, California, Chicago, New York, New Orleans, the last time I think I gave this talk. But this is the place to give it, right? Coventry, for reasons that will become apparent, feels like the perfect, the special, the ideal place to give this talk. And there are a few reasons for that I wanted to talk about, because it feels like a way of relating the talk to our space and this moment that we're in. In the first place, the part of the book that I'll read is a fairly personal experience of revision. It speaks a little bit to my own work, to my life experience. And it is, as Helen mentioned, set in Coventry, so it's great to come back and be able to read into that space here to you guys. But there's also a way in which this is the school I went to, and in many ways this book grows out of my now 25-year-long teaching career. It's shocking to think it's been that long. So in a certain sense, having been a student here, there's a way in which talking about my own teaching experience also feels right in this regard as well. And I should say, the book grows out of that teaching experience. One of the things I notice a lot when I try and teach creative writing to my students is that the process of revision is a challenging and slightly vexing one for them, I think, in various ways. And there are a lot of reasons for that, I think. On the one hand, we're all of us, readers, writers, somewhat enthralled to what I think of as the romance of the first draft, right? The first draft feels inspired. It feels authentic. I often think about the famous story, some of you may have even seen this at the various exhibits, of Jack Kerouac writing on the road on a long, continuous roll of paper. He typed very fast. The Benzedrine helped, I believe, in those contexts. And so there's the first draft of On the Road is this long scroll. His editor, in fact, when he got it, said, how am I going to edit this thing? And so in various museums of writing around the world, I've seen this in London, I've seen this in France, I've seen this back in Chicago, you can see Kerouac's scroll. And so there's a sense in which this becomes an iconic image of writerly inspiration, writerly first drafts, the wonder of first is best coming up in various ways like that. And so I think that romance of the first draft is one of the reasons why we tend to overlook revision in some other ways. It's probably also true that many of our first experiences of revision take place in settings a little like this. We encounter it in school, right? So we have teachers telling us to do revision, and revision can feel, in that context, sometimes a little dull. It feels like fix the grammar, fix the spelling. It feels mechanical in some ways. It feels like the antithesis of the excitement of the creation of a first draft in various ways. And again, that tends to mean that revision gets a little scanted in some ways, I think, in the way we think about this. Probably, and I say this with hesitation because my friend Richard is a professional psychologist, that there's probably some kind of psychological barrier to the way we think about revision, right? To engage in the process of revision is, in a sense, to acknowledge my first draft has in some form or other fallen short or failed, right? We have to acknowledge that failure, and as we think about revision, we have to think about the additional work of fixing those difficulties, fixing those problems, moving forward in various ways. So there's a kind of hesitancy built into that. Writers are, if nothing else, I think, maybe I'm only speaking for myself here, but maybe for others, we are lazy by nature. So the idea of doing the work again is a little challenging to us in many instances, I think, along the way as well. So there's that hesitation. I think maybe we should take some hope from Samuel Beckett's line about failing better. Revision, if you could argue, if you might think about it, is a process of continually failing better, draft after draft after draft. It's also true, I think, that writing advice, the kind of things I say to students in classes, some of the things that folks here may have heard about writing as well, often, I think, tends to overlook or reduce the way we think about revision. Right? So I'm thinking particularly of classic writerly advice, write what you know. Right? Which makes a lot of sense in many ways. It speaks to the authority of the author. Part of my contract with readers is to say, if you're going to give me the time to read 250 pages, or even if it's a short story, 20 pages, the contract is that I know something about what I'm talking about, right? That I know something that I'm going to convey to you. So there's some value in that advice. Like all bits of creative writing advice, it's a little bit like an old wives' tale. There's some rule of thumb value to it. It's kind of a folk wisdom, but it has a certain value, I think, at a certain point. The difficulty, though, is that if we think about that construction, write what you know, it implies a timeline. I know it, and then I write it. It implies essentially a fundamental before and after to the process. And I think in some ways that, again, shortchanges the revision process. It seems to imply that I have my great idea and I put it on the page, and then all I'm about is trying to perfect that idea. Whereas I think most of us, as we write, understand that we think as we write, that we write to know that the writing itself is a way of generating knowledge and insight and understanding of our text. Most of us have felt this as writers when we have a great shining idea, we write into it for a little while, and then we go, oh my goodness, my idea is not as good as I thought it would be. In fact, demoralizing as that might be, it's often a sign that the idea is more complicated than we thought it would be, requires more attention in some ways. In fact, that's a sign and a spur towards further revision in various ways. So I would argue that the write what you know, the before and after of that, tends to sort of make us feel as though revision is just a kind of like, I've already had the inspiration, then I have to do all the work, and I'm going to make a case that revision is a more organic, ongoing thing, that is a process that is subject to inspiration, discovery, and new creation, I think, in various ways as well. So I want you to bear that in mind as we go through the conversation here along the way. Let's see. The single largest reason, though, I think, why revision for my students seems a little mysterious, a little hard to grapple with, their resistance to it, I think, is enshrined in, is this idea that we don't have a lot of great examples of revision. By its nature, when we read a book, we read a short story, we read a poem, we are reading something in its final draft, right? That's the nature of the beast. And revision, therefore, in a certain sense, deliberately covers its own tracks. It hides its own process in various ways. This is particularly true, of course, of the written arts, right? We're always reading final drafts of novels or of stories. If we were in painting, painters will often open up their studios. If you have a gallery show, you'll often see a series of works which have a rough analog to a process of revision. If we were in the dramatic arts, we would share a rehearsal space. We would see other artists working on their revision process, essentially, which in those spaces is called a rehearsal process. But in writing, we tend to cover up that process. We don't have a lot of insight into each other's drafting process, I think, in various ways. And that's tricky because most writers learn from other writers. Most writers will learn a skill in their writing from reading other writers. So I might say, okay, my dialogue skills aren't great. I will read a writer who does dialogue great and learn from that. How do I handle time in a narrative? I'll read somebody else, see how they do that, and figure that out from them. But if the revision process is a little occluded from us, it's harder for us to learn how others have revised. Right? Now, occasionally, mostly thanks to the work of scholars, we do get glimpses into people's revision processes, right? So to choose a local example, I was just reading that Middlemarch, right? George Eliot's Middlemarch, notionally a fictional representation of Coventry back in the day, although she would not, of course, recognize contemporary Coventry, I suspect, that it's a book that is composed, in fact, of two separate novels that Eliot was working on at a certain point, right? One called Miss Brooke, we recognize Dorothea Brooke's name from that title, another one called Middlemarch. She brought those two texts together in some ways, right? And that kind of hybridization of projects feels very natural to the revision process, but one that we don't appreciate as we're reading the book in its final form, I think, in various ways. I think one of the nice notes about the revision of Middlemarch is that in one of those drafts, the town, based notionally at Coventry, that we now know of as Middlemarch, was called, I think, Misterton. So we can see those little traces of shifting as we move through those spaces, right? But outside of scholarly works, we don't really have a lot of access to examples of revision. And so one of the things I do, in fact, with students to demystify, to make the revision process a little bit more familiar, is at least try and look around in the world that's familiar to them and to all of us for examples of what we might call quasi-revision, what I sometimes call revision by another hand. So the last time you went to the cinema and saw an adaptation of a book and for film, revision by another hand. It's a kind of version of revision. The last time you saw a sequel, kind of a revision. A reboot, kind of a revision. The last time you listened to a cover version of a song, a kind of revision. Right? Different interpretations that make these things more familiar. Growing up here on a school trip, I remember with Richard, I remember vividly going to see a production of Julius Caesar at the RSC. We were 14 or 15. First time I went out there, it was a production of Julius Caesar that featured big video screens coming down from the gods where the actors projected on it for the speeches. And that idea that we're familiar with, I think, from going there, that Shakespeare's plays can be adapted, can be reinterpreted, that's also a form of revision by another hand. Revision by a director, by actors, by a cast of an existent play, I think, in various ways. So that sense of expanding seems like a useful way of thinking into this question of revision a little bit as well. And of course, this is also a reason, I think, why it's sort of uniquely appropriate to talk about this subject in Coventry. We are living in a town, a city, that is itself very much, I think, a site, a city of revision. We don't, of course, live in George Eliot's Middlemarch. She wouldn't, as I say, recognize the city as her own anymore, in part because of the violent revisions to the city in November of 1940, right? But also because of post-war reconstruction of the city centre, the depredations of recession in the 70s and 80s that I remember quite well, and the more recent imagining of the city for the City of Culture year. The city even offers us, I suppose, in a certain sense, side-by-side drafts, in a sense, of the cathedral. We have the old, we have the new, we have the ruined, we have the replaced, right, in various ways. So I think we, maybe more than others, have a kind of visual sense of that. We can walk around in a couple of drafts of our local cathedral, I think, in various ways. And finally, of course, coming back here today, seeing a few old, slightly older, but maybe we'll say revised faces, maybe that's the nice way of thinking about that, reminds me that the revision is not just something that writers do, it's also something that happens to us, to all of us. We don't just revise our books and stories revise us and change us. More broadly, life, time, and the times that we live in change and revise us, all of us, which is what I'd like to focus on for the balance of this talk. I should add, by the way, by way of apology, that this invisibility of revision that I'm describing is also my excuse for talking a lot about me and my work in what follows. Those subjects are essentially the only things I'm truly expert in, and I appreciate you bearing with me as I go about them. So, speaking of time, and thinking about this location, I want to take us back 40-some years to 1979, which was the year I started here at Henry's, and to a couple of formative experiences that have shaped and reshaped my life and work ever since. 1979, as it turns out, was the first time I saw myself in print in, courtesy of Helen, this issue of the Coventry, the school magazine, which Helen very kindly found and sent to me a few years back. The piece in it, which is a tiny essay about climbing Snowdon of all things, is embarrassing in all the usual ways of juvenilia. Actually, I think the embarrassment of our earlier drafts is one abiding reason revision is actually invisible. Writers often destroy early drafts out of simple shame, right? So that's one of the ways in which revision covers its tracks. But I should say this particular piece is also mortifying for its sort of breezy adolescent ageism. It begins, I quote, I feel embarrassed to quote this. Anyway, it begins. I feel like I want to put on some stentorian 13-year-old voice, but I'm not going to try that. It begins, every Welshman between the ages of 5, when he first realizes its significance, and 60, when he decides he is too frail to negotiate the climb, wants to conquer that edifice of rock, that legendary burial place of Arthur, Mount Snowdon. Now, I'm 55 now. I'll be 56 in a couple of months, and I'm very much hoping that 60 isn't quite as frail as my 13-year-old self seemed to imagine. And yet, embarrassing as it most certainly is, that piece is also an anticipation of sorts. It's probably not a coincidence that my first published writing is set in North Wales. It's also, as it turns out, the setting of my first novel, The Welsh Girl, which I should point out, since one of them is here, contains characters named in an affectionate nod for 2 of my former teachers here today. Viv is here and Peter Lockyer is not here, but they know that already. Don't worry, I'm not surprising them with that news. Anyway, however well or not I might remember the piece itself in the Coventry, the feeling of seeing it in print is indelible. It might still be my ideal of publication. I didn't know it was being included until the issue appeared, so it came as a complete surprise, an unexpected gift. Unlike the now more typical anxious and anticlimactic wait between the acceptance of any book or story and its appearance between covers months or even years later. Plus, it's one of the very rare instances, in my experience at least, of actually seeing people reading something you've written, and being relatively kind about it. My friends were fairly generous, I think. Now, I'd been writing fiction at that point, terrible, derivative science fiction mostly, for a few years before that publication. But it's not an exaggeration to say it was the moment that changed my life. that revised my life. I wanted that experience again. We often think of revision as retrospective. We look back and we change something. But this was an instance of future revision, of seeing and re-seeing my future, of reimagining what it might be. And in that, I was helped by an interview in that same issue of the Coventry with our most famous literary alumnus. We've been talking about him a lot today, Philip Larkin, the centenary of whose birth we're also marking this year. Larkin, for reasons we'll come to, might seem a somewhat unlikely role model for me. But at 13, the only prejudice of his I was suspicious of was his pronouncement in the interview that he couldn't stand science fiction. More importantly, he was proof and a promise of sorts that you could be born in Coventry, you go to King Henry's, and you could still become a writer. His first poem, actually, had even been written for homework here. Now, this is noticed from 1979. Larkin would have been 57, so just a couple of years older than I am now. 3 years later, I'd be studying his Wits and Weddings for A-levels. 5 years later, while I was in my second year at university, he'd die of cancer at 63. Now, Larkin, as some of you may even have noticed today, is commemorated at our railway station with a plaque which quotes lines from his poem, I Remember, I Remember, the original title of which, by the way, was Revenant. It's a poem about passing through the town by train, and just to quote a quick line from that, "Why Coventry," I explained, "I was born here." What the plaque omits, more an instance of editing than revision, are the later stanzas of Larkin's less than flattering memories of the city, quote, "where my childhood was unspent," and especially the same poem's final damning lines, again quoting, "Nothing like something happens anywhere," which when I first read it in school, enraged and dismayed me, perhaps in equal measure. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was still true all those years later on from Larkin's youth. Even those few famous happenings of Coventry's past, after all, can seem oddly like nothing. The bombing that reduced the city centre to nothing. Lady Godiva's wearing nothing. Even her nakedness was an odd kind of non-event, unobserved by the townsfolk, apart from Peeping Tom, of course. As for the Coventry of my youth, the lyrics of another poet, another alumnus of the school, Jerry Dammers of the Specials, summed it up pretty perfectly a couple of years later. This town is coming like a ghost town. Nothing like something happens anywhere. I might have hated that sentiment, but I recognized it and shared it, another connection to Larkin. And just maybe it spurred in me that writerly imp of jealousy. I wish I'd written it. But something else did happen in 1979, something much darker, but no less inspiring for my future writing than showing up in the pages of the Coventry. That's the episode that opens and closes this little book. And it's my most personal example of revision, and one that I hope illuminates the topic. Revision is, in a sense, the story of a story. The story of how a novel or a story gets written. So let's start with a story. And this is a section from the book itself that I'll close out with. Here is a story. It happens to be true. In 1979, when I was 12 or 13, around the same age as my own son when I wrote this, I witnessed an act of heroism on my father's part. Not everyday heroism of the working a job he hated to support his family variety, or the faithful to his wife for 50 years variety, or even the regular visits to his aged mother in a nursing home variety, though he practiced all of those too, but old school, stand up, risking physical harm for the sake of another heroism. This was here in Coventry, my hometown, a busy Saturday morning in the city centre, Hertford Street, if memory serves. Through the crowds of shoppers, we saw a boy, a teenager, a few years older than me, maybe 16 or 17, running towards us. We probably heard him first, his footsteps echoing off the concrete and plate glass. Except he wasn't just running, I thought. He was running a race, leading 3 or 4 others. Except they weren't racing him, I realized. They were chasing him. And they were skinheads, and he was wearing a turban. And this, of course, was at a time when the National Front was in ascendant. But even as I registered these details, I couldn't make sense of them in the moment, clinging to my first impression that it might all have been some lark teenage hijinks. Even when the chasers caught up with the chased, knocked him down, put the boot in, I don't think I fully understood what was happening. Nor, I'm sure, did the other shoppers around us. I like to think they didn't intervene, not out of fear for themselves, there was no time for that rationalization, but out of simple shock and incomprehension. In fact, my father was the only one to go to that boy's aid, pushing and pulling the attackers off him. And luckily, as bullies will, they ran off as soon as confronted, and luckily their victim wasn't too badly injured, physically at least. After picking himself up and dusting himself off, he thanked my father, but refused further help, in the, of course, quintessentially British form of the offer of a cup of tea, and he hastily limped off in the other direction. The whole thing probably took less than 5 minutes. The crowd of Saturday shoppers began to flow again, and after a moment my father and I merged with it. I don't even recall much talking about the incident with him. But of course, I've never forgotten it. And here is a revision of that story. A version of it that I told near the start of my 2007 novel, The Welsh Girl, transposed to 1930s Germany, and told from the point of view of a German Jew called Rotherham, the anglicized version of Roth that he eventually adopts, grappling with a decision to emigrate from Germany. He'd been set against leaving, even after seeing a fellow beaten in the street. It had happened so fast, the slap of running feet, a man rounding the corner, hand on his hat, chased by 3 others. Rotherham had no idea what was going on, even as the boots went in, and then it was over. The thugs charging off, their victim curled on the wet cobbles. It was a busy street and no one moved, just watched the man roll onto one knee, pause for a moment taking stock of his injuries, then pull himself to his feet, limp hurriedly away, not looking at any of them. As if ashamed, Rotherham thought. He'd barely understood what was happening, yet still he felt as if he'd failed. Not a test of courage, not that, he told himself, but a test of comprehension. He felt stupid, standing there, gawking like all the rest, too slow on the uptake to even have time to fear for himself. But when he told his mother, she clutched his hand and made him promise not to get involved in such things. He shook her off in disgust, repeated that he hadn't been afraid, but she told him sharply, "You should have been." So, a story and its revision. A pairing which I'd like to use to consider the nature of revision. I'll revisit this specific example in more detail later, but for now, I just want to ask the basic question. What's changed? The setting and the context most obviously, the place and time as I described in my preamble to each version, and the attendant details. One victim wears a hat, the other a turban. But also we might note the action has changed. The thugs choose to run off rather than being run off, and the characters too have changed. Notably, there's no hero, no figure equivalent to my father. Plus, the attack in Germany is observed by a somewhat older point of view figure. Rotherham is a young man, suspended somewhere between my childhood and my father's adulthood at the time of the original incident. Now, we could pursue this catalogue of changes further, of course, down to the level of individual word choices. The echoing footsteps in the first version versus the slap of running feet in the second, say, 2 descriptions of the same sound, one hinting at the reverberations of memory, the other a foreshadowing of violence. And yet, for all these myriad changes, it's also worth noting how much of the initial story, its basic terms, remain. It's still recognizably the same event, down to its details, which is how we know it's a revision. So as we try to parse out the nature of revision, we might refine our initial question. Thus, what do all these changes add up to, even as our drafts remain recognizably related? How is the resultant whole greater than the sum of its altered parts and those that remain the same? One answer, I'd suggest, is that the meaning of the episode has been changed. Or we could argue that both versions of my story share our political meaning. Both versions broadly indict racist violence, an indictment magnified by the echo across time. The skinheads are, after all, neo-Nazis. But I'd contend that the meaning of the episode, at the character level, has also been significantly modified. One instance is an example of courage, my father's, with all the hope that that brings. The other, with its focus on the passive, paralyzed witness, is an instance of something else. Maybe not cowardice per se, but perhaps the fear of cowardice, my own. Let's call it guilt, bystander guilt, survivor guilt, something unresolved that readers anticipate might play out in the narrative to come. I mentioned earlier that my father, the putative hero, isn't in the revision, but that's not quite true. He is present in some ghostly form, in the figure of Rotherham's mother and her warning not to get involved in such attacks, which is what my father told me after the incident I witnessed. Think of that for a moment. Here was a moment of heroism on the part of my father, a moment when I was most proud of him, and his reaction was to warn me off such acts of bravery, to tell me essentially not to be like him at precisely the moment when I most wanted to be. That's a protective parental instinct, of course. I was 12, after all. But one I interpreted as a child as a lack of faith in me, a sense that if called on in a crisis, I would be found wanting. I couldn't begin to articulate that at the time, but as an adult, writing about it, and via an older character's point of view in Rotherham, I was able to make it an essential narrative conflict. I talked about the meaning of the episode being altered above, but it might be fairer to suggest that this other meaning was already inherent in the event. Revision hasn't changed it so much as uncovered it, brought it forward into the light. In doing so, the emphasis of the episode has shifted. The stress is no longer on bravery, but on cowardice. The point to reiterate here is that for all the changes to setting and character, for all the recognizable terms that remain, what's changed or deepened is what the episode means, which is to say, how it feels. That's what revision adds up to. As an aside, a slightly awkward one, it's perhaps worth noting here, pausing here to revisit some less fortunate parallels to Philip Larkin. I mentioned above that he's an unlikely role model for me, mostly because of the posthumous revision of his reputation following the publication of letters which revealed him, among other things, to harbour a streak of bigotry. But before we damn him outright, it's worth noting another connection, that his too is a father-son story, and also one that reaches back to World War II. For back in the 1930s, Larkin's father was something of a Nazi sympathizer who twice attended Nuremberg rallies and kept a statuette of Hitler on the mantelpiece before the war. Larkin's own most famous line, cover your ears, mother, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad," from his poem This Be the Verse, has a rather different meaning in that context, I suspect. I should say, too, there's arguably a third revision of that event from my childhood in my 2016 novel, The Fortunes, shifted this time to Detroit, near where I live now, in 1982, and superimposed on a real-life hate crime, the murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese-American, mistaken for a Japanese by two Detroit auto workers resentful about the competition from foreign car imports. This passage is told from the point of view of a friend of his who was with him that night. They'd been together at a stag night celebrating Chin's forthcoming wedding, and he witnessed the assault. It was Vincent's idea. He told me to run, only he didn't say run, he said scram. It's the last word I heard from him in English, so I've given it a lot of thought. Scram. It's what you say to a kid, isn't it? A nuisance. Or maybe what naughty kids say to each other after they ring a doorbell. Scram. Not run. He was a runner. Running to him meant winning, running towards something. Scram, I think, meant running away. If he'd said run, we might have both run. But scram was for me. Because he didn't scram, he waited for them. He could have gotten away. When Evans hopped out of the car, it was still moving. It ran over his foot, for God's sake. It was the Keystone Clan out there. You think Vincent couldn't have outrun these guys? He let it in track, but he was done running. He started it at the club, after all. He would have fought in the gravel and dog shit parking lot outside too if Evans hadn't gone for the bat. He wanted to fight them. Maybe he figured he could even make Evans drop the bat, shame him into a fair fight. Maybe he figured just 2-on-1 they wouldn't feel they needed the bat. This was on Woodward, under the golden arches there, fluorescent tubes in the sign humming like cicadas. I didn't run far, to the edge of the light, just far enough to live, just far enough to watch. Scram. Who was he to tell me to scram? Who was I to listen? He was grappling with Pitts when Evans caught him across the knees as if reaching for a grounder, after which Vincent couldn't have run even if he'd wanted. Then a line drive to the chest as he went down, 2 more to the head when he was on all fours, swinging for the fences. I did run back, but too late. Vincent's last words, "It's not fair," to me in Chinese, while I cradled his ruined head, blood bubbling from his mouth and nose as he spoke, blood pouring from his ears like oil. His skull felt like rotten fruit. I describe this as arguably another revision, Because unlike the version in The Welsh Girl, I wasn't consciously recapitulating that Saturday with my father when I wrote this scene. I was more focused on retelling the circumstances of Chin's death, and yet the echoes seem inescapable in retrospect. The setting is altered once more as of the events, but several important elements doggedly persist, albeit in starkly intensified form. Most obviously, the point of view of a witness, survivor, whose guilt is now magnified threefold. He flees, the victim is a close friend, the assault is more brutal and ends tragically. In other subtle ways, this version is actually closer to the original than the retelling in The Welsh Girl. Detroit in 1982 bears striking similarities to Coventry in 1979. Both cities founded on their auto industries, both at this time subject to economic decline and a rise in racial animus driven by economic anxiety. Today, by chance, I make my home in the US, about 40 minutes from Detroit. I drove around the streets where Chin lived and died as part of my research for the book, but his story resonated with me even when I first heard it as a teenager in this city. Even the trope of running, of a foot race, has its analogue, although this time it's the victim who stands his ground, the witness who runs, at once an inversion and a kind of conflation. So 3 versions. Conscious and unconscious revisions, which raise the inevitable question, the $64,000 question, I suppose, when it comes to revision: how do we ever know that we're done, that we've reached the last word, the final draft? Well, if revision is about changing or uncovering the meaning of our stories, I'd suggest when we're done, when we finally understand them and why we wrote them. Which is to say that revision, re-seeing, is in part to change our eyes, to apprehend our work not as its writer, who thinks he or she knows what it means, but as its reader, who's figuring out what it means. It's not an accident that stories often work towards epiphany. Writers do too. By way of illustration, finally, let me return to that scene on that Coventry street in 1979. There are, of course, countless... Hold on one moment. That's a pause to build tension, sorry for that. There are, of course, countless other potential ways to revisit that story. I think of that Sikh teenager's reaction after the fight, his brief thanks, his shaking off of help, his hasty departure. As a child, I confess, I thought he was just a little ungrateful. The scene of my father's heroism seemed to require something more. When I was older, when I wrote The Welsh Girl, it seemed to me he was a little ashamed, even embarrassed, the way any of us who, say, take a fall, pick ourselves up quickly and move on almost furtively, as if to deny what just happened. Lately, when I think of that story, I like to think he was just being British. Stiff upper lip, no fuss, please, the very things those skinheads would have denied him. Though, I confess also, in bleaker moments, I also wonder if he just couldn't stand to see another white face, even a friendly one. Lately, of course, means in this moment, this temporal context, which has included stark political divisions in the UK around Brexit and in the US, where I live now, following the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And indeed, since 2016, I found myself reaching back to that story about my father, a white working-class man coming to the aid of a person of colour in an era when Britishness very much meant whiteness, as a small crumb of hope. But the story has also returned to me for other than political reasons. My father was still alive in 2016, though even then I occasionally spoke and wrote of him in the past tense. He was in a care home, suffering from dementia, his memory just about gone. Not, sadly, an uncommon situation, and a distressing one for any of us, of course, but a particular personal distress for me, and likely for any writer, was that my father had often been a source of stories. Much of The Welsh Girl drew on his childhood wartime experiences in Wales, and by 2016, that source was stopped. His failing memory surely prompted me to recall more of my memories of him, as did the fact that when I visited him in his home, I often took my son, his grandson. I suspect my father did not always recognize me when we visited, but he did respond to my boy, perhaps even mistaking him for me as a child. It means a great deal to me that my son knew his grandfather, but I also wonder how he will recall him, which will include the stories he's heard about him, stories like this one, which may explain why I keep circling back to it. I want to get it right. And what fascinates me today about that scene in Hertford Street is not me, my non-reaction. Perhaps I've worked through that in the intervening drafts. What fascinates me now is my father's reaction. Why he, alone among all the other adults on that street, stepped into the breach, and so swiftly, without apparent conscious decision-making. I used to think it had to do with his upbringing in Wales. He grew up in a small village where the habit of helping others was ingrained in him. Certainly he was always a good neighbour to folks on our street here. One elderly woman across the road who he used to look in on and do odd jobs for remembered him in her will when she passed by way of thanks, money that eventually went towards his own care. So that's what I put it down to. A brand of rural, working class, salt-of-the-earth decency that as a middle-class city kid I felt I never had complete access to. But while all of those things were true of my father, I've recently come to another conclusion, another understanding, one some of you, better readers of my life than I, may have already guessed. My father, as I've noted, was white. I'm mixed race. Details elided from the previous versions of the story, even if Rotherham's German-Jewish status in The Welsh Girl is an odd refraction of my own dual identity. I don't think race, our races, factored much into my thinking when I was a child. He was just my dad, I was just his son. But I suspect it did feature in my father's. He was always very protective of me. I can recall being irritated at him, say, for stopping me going to a local park to play soccer with friends because a National Front march was taking place the same day. Years afterwards, he told me he'd once found racist graffiti spray painted on our garage door. The reason I only found out about it years later, he painted over it, his own act of revision, before I saw it. This man, I'm now sure, feared for me, his non-white son, and fear, among other things, is a great spur to the imagination. It keeps us up at night. It's blindingly obvious to me now that in his fear my father had imagined me as the victim of a racist attack. As a father myself, I now know what any of us would give to be able to defend our child in such a moment. So here's how I now understand that moment on that Coventry street 4 decades ago, an understanding I've only discovered recently, partly in the process of this writing. That poor Sikh teenager was the victim of the beating my father had always feared for me. My father was able to react so fast because he recognized instantly what he was seeing before his eyes, because he had already seen it in his nightmares, as if it were a prophecy. And that for that reason, he was also ready to act. There are a lot of things the story might mean now. Political meanings about preparedness, about our ability to recognize evil before our eyes, about civic responsibility. I'm well aware, too, that the story might today be categorized as a white savior narrative. But none of these readings get to the personal meaning of the story, the reason I've felt compelled to retell it over and over. For me, for all that I admired my father's heroism that day, there was always that glimmer of distance between us. He acted, I didn't. Never mind couldn't or shouldn't as a child. That's the trace of shame, the fear of that proud as I was of him, I might not grow into a man who would do the same, who he could be proud of in turn. A fear that his warning to not get involved only stoked as if he didn't think me strong enough. But of course, it's not a story of heroism or cowardice. It's a story of love, of the closeness between us, not the distance. And I'd suggest it's always been that story, even if it's taken me 40 years to understand it. 40 years, countless retellings, in fiction, in anecdotes, in memory. 40 years of revision, essentially, to see that there, at the very beginning, at the heart of the thing, was that truth. 40 years to find it. And just in time. My father passed away in the spring of 2018. The last time I told this story was at his funeral. 40 years. And you know what? It's worth it. And that's what revision is. And that's why we do it. And just finally, to give Larkin the last word, from the closing lines of An Arundel Tomb, lines now quoted on his own memorial in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, what will survive of us is love. Thank you. So should we do questions? Yeah. So I'm happy to take a few questions. I don't want to keep people too long, but I'm going to slip on the distance glasses so I can see you if you have a question to ask.
Yes, so if anybody has got a question for Peter, please, just indicate in the normal way. I've got a question.
Oh, sure.
I recently spent some time in the Hull archives looking at, among other things, looking at some of Philip Larkin's workbooks.
Yes, right. Some of which were discovered in a in a tip at one point? I felt like...
No, Phillips, was it?
No, I think they were some other poems that were uncertain as to whether they were written by Larkin, but that's when Monica Jones died and the house was...
Right, that's it, yes.
They ended up in some second-hand dealer's place, I think. That's right. Not the Workbooks, though.
Right.
He kept, even as a very young man and writer, he kept workbooks, and you can see him working and reworking his poems. And what's obviously, it's quite overwhelming, is the amount of material that was kept. And I just wondered whether, as a writer, you find yourself keeping things, whether you have to be a sort of hoarder.
I do keep everything, right? And I do it for ignoble reasons. Were Larkin alive today, were he still a librarian at Hull, he would be familiar with, as you were, will be, Helen, a phenomenon in which libraries, often university libraries, will buy a writer's archive. Right? Now, often in the past that would happen after death. Archive would be discovered, would be donated, or would be acquired by a library. Now, I am not remotely eminent enough to do this, but I've had colleagues who have, while still alive, sold their archive to a university archive. I'm not going to recognize how much, speak to how much money, but probably a tidy sum, depending on who it might be. And these weren't always famous writers, but they might be a writer who, I'm thinking of one of my colleagues who studied with John Updike, might have had correspondence with lots of different people. So whether their own work is partly valued for the archive, or whether their correspondence might be valued for the archive, might play into that space. And while I don't hope to realize that boon for my retirement, there's still a part of me that keeps those things. So I've been lucky enough to have a lot of great students, some of whom have gone on to be sort of household names. When I was first in graduate school as a creative writer, I was a student with a writer some of you will know called Jhumpa Lahiri, who's quite well known, won the Pulitzer Prize. Back then, when we would exchange manuscripts as part of the class, we'd write comments on each of the stories, hand them back. I'm pretty sure I still have somewhere, don't ask me where, but somewhere in a box, I have copies of my manuscripts marked up by Jhumpa, and maybe one day, in the fullness of time, that could be valuable. So I tend to be a hoarder. There are, however, I think writers, I talk a little bit in the book about the example of the American writer Raymond Carver, very famous short story writer, whose reputation in the 80s and after his death in the 90s was enormous, right? Hugely influential short story writer especially. Carver's reputation has been modulated a little bit, maybe even compromised, by a sense from the archives that many of the versions of his stories, and in some ways his signature minimalist style, is actually a creation to some degree of his editor, a guy called Gordon Lish, who sometimes would take a Carver story and literally cut it in half, right? Line by line, rewrite endings, quite intrusive editorial changes that we now know from Carver's correspondence he was uneasy with. There was a power relationship. Lish was a writer, had been a friend, a great supporter. Carver's working class background probably meant that he couldn't really challenge Lish. I think in some ways he was grateful to him in many ways. But you can sort of see the anguish in some of his letters to him, because I think he also began to feel the embarrassment. I showed this draft to another writer I know, and now that it's going to come out in a published version that doesn't really resemble that version anymore. How do I reconcile them? So I'm thinking here of the American writer Tobias Wolff, who was a friend of Carver's. And Wolff says he destroys his drafts now, and partly because he, I think, is wary of the potential reputational damage of somebody going back into old drafts. So while I tend to keep everything, I think there are writers who also tend to destroy things along the way as well. So that part of covering your tracks, that shame about those early drafts, is enacted, I think, very much in Tobias Wolff's way of thinking about this. Okay. There was another... Yes, please.
Yes, sorry. I was thinking about the mixed race issue that you mentioned, and I wondered whether you feel protective of your children if you consider that they may be mixed race in today's society.
That's a really good question. My son is only a quarter Chinese. There's lots of other things in there. Irishness, Welshness, who knows what else, and does not, I think, present as non-white, right? So I think for him, would we call it passing? I don't think so. I think he just looks like most people. So I think for him, the consciousness of that is less prevalent, less driven, and it may also be that where he's growing up, university town, very liberal, very multicultural, that even if he did, it would not factor in, I think, as much to his lived experience, I think, in lots of ways. While Detroit is close, we're about 45 minutes away, and it's a different kind of space, I think, in lots of ways. So I don't think about that as much for him, but I do think that I didn't understand that parental protective instinct until I had a child. So there's that way in which life experiences revises the way we understand a past moment. I don't think I understood my father until I became a father in some shorthand way. And so that shift, that revelation did feel as though it changed the meaning of that episode for me, but maybe also, as I say, uncovered a meaning that I had not previously had access to, I think, in some ways as well. And because it varies a little bit from where I go from place to place in the US. So my wife is from the New Jersey Shore, famous for Bruce Springsteen and The Sopranos a little bit, I suppose. And occasionally in bars at the Jersey Shore, when she and I walk in together, yeah, I think people look and wonder. You know, I think about the distance in time it is since the Supreme Court decision about the Loving decision that made mixed marriage in the US legal, which was just a couple of years before my mother's own marriage in this country. I take that for granted. I think my generation takes that for granted. But even in a northeastern state like New Jersey, mostly Democratic, there are still places where it might cause eyes to follow you around a room. So I'm still occasionally conscious of that in different parts of the US. But it's very hard to generalize. When I lived in Atlanta for a while, I assumed I would be read as Asian. When I spoke, or British, and they understood me as a Yankee because I'd come from Boston, and that seemed really strange to me. Maybe a badge of honor. I'm not sure. Anyway, so that's a very rambly answer to a good question.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Yes, please.
Peter, thanks for a brilliant talk.
Oh, thank you.
Really lovely. I'm fascinated by this moment in your own life when you go to Manchester to do physics.
Oh, yeah.
And you talked about, you sort of hinted that you wanted to be a writer when you were much younger,
Yeah.
but you go off to do physics, and then you change track.
Yeah.
So can you just talk us through that sort of period and how you made that decision in your sort of journey?
So that's really interesting. I mean, I talk a little bit more in the book about my dad. And, my father was an engineer, but worked for the GEC in the city back in the day, telecommunications engineer, although back in the day when it was electromechanical relays and all that kind of stuff, right? And had come to that position partly through being in the Signals Corps when he did his national service, and partly through an apprenticeship with the company. So not through college, not through university. And I think through much of the years of my youth, he was bumping up against that ceiling where now he was competing for promotions with university graduates and who are a little bit more better versed in the more recent technologies. And so he was bumping into those limits. And so I think for him, in some ways, my studying physics, going to university to study physics, was a form of generational revision, right? I started talking about that. It's going a little bit further, but in a similar vein that will allow me to sort of get around the blockage that he was encountering, I think, in his professional life. And I sympathize with that. I think we often imagine the next generation as a kind of revised, new and improved version of ourselves. Yeah, right. But it also maybe speaks to the paucity of our imaginations, because we can only imagine going in this path, but further and better. Right. And so I think some of that inspired my decision to do physics. I can remember talking to very helpful careers counselors here at the school, early 80s, as we might remember, a period of economic struggle, and the idea of doing a degree in English seemed a lot less bankable than doing one in physics, right? And, I think what derailed that for me is it's such a strange thing to think about. My grandmother, my father's mother, had begun to suffer from dementia herself back then, and was in a home. Used to go and visit her with my mother and father. Fairly difficult experience for the family. Some of the facilities for folks like that back then, not as good as the place my father ended up, I think, here. And I ended up writing about that for the first time in fiction. I've been writing lots of science fiction, and now I wrote something that was very different and very personal, and to me, as the writer of it, more powerful. Right? I think I realized some of the power of fiction in that dynamic. And partly because I've been encouraged by teachers here to send out a few of my stories to small magazines, I sent that one out. And I got a rejection slip back, just barely, just a printed thing. And at the bottom of it, there was a little scribble from the editor. He had terrible handwriting, so I couldn't read it to start with. And it was only one word, if that. Actually, I thought for a while, his biro's run out of ink. He's just been doing that, right, as we do. And after a little studying, deciphering, I realized the single word he'd written on this thing was possibilities. And that one word was the most encouragement I received as a writer for about 3 years. But it also completely derailed my physics career. I, very gratefully to my parents, I did the deal after a couple of years. I will finish the physics degree, get a good degree, and they agreed to help me fund to go back to college and do an English degree. So I, strangely enough, I'm a terrible at advertisement of undergraduate education. I have 2 of them, right? I feel like one wasn't enough, go and get another one. And that, going back to study English, got me a little bit more into the writerly mindset and helped me move into that space. Although it still took me going to the US and going to a creative writing program to get into that space. So that's sort of that transition. I think I realized that while physics was a sensible thing to do, and I was a hard worker and I was good at math, I did not fundamentally have any talent for it. I didn't have any feel for it. And I think probably I realized that if I were to pursue a career with my physics degree, was going to doom me to have to work incredibly hard for the rest of my life, and I might want to change this path with a little bit more talent in the writing venue, even if it might be less
fun.
Yeah, that's right. Have more fun, and maybe even if it might be a little less remunerative and a little bit more perilous in some ways, do a thing that I love to do. So that was the slightly roundabout and slow process. I envy my American students now because they go to college and they don't, as we do here, I think we still do here, they don't essentially choose their subject before they go, right? My son has an idea, but he will, as they say in the US, declare a major to study in after a year or two. And he can take a lot of general classes, first of all, and sort of find out what he wants to do. And although he has an idea, it seems possible that idea might change. I was deciding, scientist, physicist, at about 14. And certainly, by 16 or 18, you're tracked into that. Yeah. I used to sneak into English lectures when I was in Manchester, when I was studying physics. But now, as I teach creative writing, I have lots of those students. I have physics students, I have biologists, I have political scientists, and it's great because they're all interesting writers. They have interesting things to say. It really enhances that class. It's not just a bunch of English majors, although I love those guys as well. It feels like it's a really healthy opportunity for them, I think, in lots of ways. So, yeah. Oh, please, yeah.
When you do versions and revisions of your stories, do you use...
We've enjoyed meeting you.
Thanks.
When you do versions and revisions of your stories,
Yep.
which you've talked a lot about, do you use computer? Do you use a word program?
Oh, yeah, right.
Or do you develop them longhand?
So this is a fascinating question because technology changes our relationship to the revision, right? So I was talking about Kerouac and thinking about back in the day when people are typing it up. You type up a draft. You've got a manuscript water with myself in my enthusiasm. You have a pile of papers. That's a draft. And then you go back to the typewriter, you roll in a blank piece of paper, type up another draft, another pile of papers. Oh, look, that's draft number 2, right? And as you'll know, many of us work on the computer. As Philip Roth used to say, the drafts disappear into one another. Even our language, how many drafts did you write? 1, 2, 5, 10. It's antiquated language, because as we revise on the screen, we're infinitesimal. Every draft we write is sort of embedded in the previous one. So we lose a sense of the progression through the drafts. So even the language of revision, I think, has been changed by technology. Now, there are writers who try to change their relationship to the text draft by draft, right? So a common piece of advice, one I give to my students, is that it is very healthy for them at some point to read their work aloud, right? And I warn them, don't do this in your dorm room or your flat, and don't whisper it, right? Because you're embarrassed that somebody will overhear you. You have to wait maybe for somebody to go out, but then read it aloud, because you've got to embody it, right? Because I think we're so used to seeing a text on the screen or on the page, we apprehend it through this sensory organ. But when we read it aloud, we're embodying it, and we're hearing it, right? So revision is an act of re-seeing, reapprehending our work. So if we can reapprehend it through a different sensory organ, we have a chance of seeing different things. The classic example of this is when you read work aloud, that's when you realize, when you could feel yourself getting out of breath reading that sentence, oh, that sentence is probably a little too long, because I can't do it in a breath, right? I can't get it out in a breath. So that sensitivity, I think, is useful. My own ear is often, sometimes embarrassingly so, when I read stuff aloud, even at readings of published work, oh, nuts, I recognize that echo. I used that word a couple of sentences earlier. I wouldn't see that on the screen. I hear it when I do it aloud. So there are some writers who take this to real extremes. They will start writing a draft on longhand on a pad of paper. They'll work their way through a draft like that. Then they will type it up onto the computer. But I know of a few people who then rewrite it longhand. Crazy, right? That sounds like a lot of work to me, but that's their method. And then sometimes even read it into a dictaphone and listen back to it. So the idea is that draft by draft, those particular writers are changing the way they engage with the work in an effort to try and see it, hear it, engage with it in slightly different ways. And so I do think that's kind of an interesting model, I think, sometimes to think about as well. So technology definitely shapes the way we think about this. I'm a little too wedded to the computer to do all of those stages myself, but I admire those folks who do that.
One of the advantages I was thinking is, in a fraction of a second, you can have a complete copy of your book.
Right.
And still keep the old version.
Right, yes, which really helps.
Yeah.
There is a kind of idea that the danger of the word processor is that our work, because we have a nice font and we can justify it and it prints out beautifully, that our work looks publishable before it is, right? It looks more professional than it is. So that's one of the slight traps in this regard as well. Let's see, there's a hand over here and then Danny as well. Yeah, go please.
There seems to be a school of thought in writing at the moment that says get your first draft down, don't mind if it's rubbish.
Right.
Rewriting,
Yeah.
right. The NaNoWriMo kind of thought. How do you interpret that? Is that something that you and don't revise until you've...
Yeah. So
how do you see that?
It's very interesting that you're talking about that in the context of NaNoWriMo. Did I get that right? Yes. National Novel Writing Month. Because I think that's a really useful bit of advice for a novelist, right? Something to think about there. I have a friend who would often say, and some of this rings a bell with a lot of writers, that it is easier to make something from something than it is to make something from nothing, right? So the first draft, the blank page, very challenging, but even a terrible first draft is something to build on, right? I think in certain ways. The challenge for novelists, I think, is can we barrel through, build up a head of momentum, get to the end, sketch it out, even if it's rough and ready in various ways. And I think there's a lot of value in doing that, right? The difficulty, though, a kind of catch-22 of novel writing, I think, often, is that I've been making a case here that writing is an act of discovery. So we have to write our story to understand our story, to discover our story, to know where our story is going. That's what makes it pleasurable, right? If you knew where it was going all the way along, which may be necessary for some forms, I think mystery writers maybe have to know some of those things along the way, but there's a danger that it can feel like painting by numbers. I know the whole thing already now, just write it out. So I think the idea of discovery is very exciting. We have to write it to know what happens. But But at the same time, we have to make a decision. What's the best way to tell my story? What point of view, what time frame, what setting, who should be my narrator? All those kind of questions come up in the question. So the question is, how do I tell it? Right? And of course, the way we choose to tell it, the best way to tell it, has to be shaped by what happens. If I start telling it in the point of view of somebody who gets killed in the middle of the book, what am I going to do now, right? So the catch-22 here is that we only know what our story is once we've told it. But at the start, we have to make a kind of guess. I think this is the best way to tell it, right? And this is where the revision question comes in, right? That in a way, that first draft is an experiment. You're testing a hypothesis. I think this is the way to tell the story, and I'm writing it along, and oh no, I've run into a roadblock, and I've killed this person off, or this person doesn't know what that person knows, so this point of view isn't going to work for me, and then what do we do, right? So that's a moment, and it can feel like failure, it can feel like a roadblock, right? It's mostly a sense that the experiment has taught us something useful. Maybe at that point we go back to the beginning and say, okay, I now know who I need to tell this story through, right? Or I know what time frame I need to tell it for, and I know what tense I need to tell it in. But actually, as you read a lot of novels, you'll see that a lot of writers encounter this. I think this is the way I should tell it. I will tell it this way for 100 pages. Oh no, I'm stuck. And then they will write part 2. And part 2 will have a different narrator, be set in a different place, have a different point of view, all those kind of things. And that's also like figuring out, oh, this has carried me so far, and I've recognized the limits of this mode of telling. I will replace it with a new mode of telling that will carry me forward in some ways as well. And I think that's a very human way to progress. I think the horror is often we have to go all the way back to the beginning, but we don't always have to. We can reinvent the book midway. And I think there are a lot of books that have that, I describe novels as having a kind of lumpy quality, right? We want them to have this lovely smooth custody consistency, but actually they're lumpy. And novels, I think I like that. They're a human product and they should operate like that. Danny, you had a question and then I'll come to the front as well.
Yes, so first, I should just contextualise my question. I'm actually an architect by profession, and I'm really intrigued by how you described this process of creative production, a process of revisions, and how it actually overlaps and connects to other people that do creativity. But it's interesting, so if you're in theatre production, or if you're like me, we're producing the built environment, which can itself be very narrative rich, lots of overlap, situated in time, working in different media, to release how we mind, barreling through to break projects, so it's all very familiar. But actually the visibility of revisions is actually much more overt in some ways. Because you're not a singular creator, you're working in a team.
Right, yes.
But the other thing is that there's an expectation because you've got an audience, you've got an end user, so the context situation production. So the question is, basically, are you sort of free, the voice of your reader? Or do they inform the expectation?
Good question.
That informs how you revise things?
Right. So, I talk a lot with my students about creative writing as an act of communication, which implies somebody that we're communicating to, right? One of the things I was just saying over lunch to somebody earlier on was a kind of mantra I try and bear in mind and remind my students of. It's a line from a Wilco song, actually. It's, I am trying to break your heart, right? When I write a piece of work, that's one of the things I remind myself of. And I have to remind myself of it because I think actually, not in great ways, I'm probably sometimes, maybe because of the academic background, I'm a little bit too cerebral a writer. I'm interested in the intellectual stuff and the themes and all that stuff. So I have to remind myself that the emotional element is important. And of course I could reframe that in terms of not just breaking your heart, I'm trying to make you laugh your ass off, whatever it might be, right? An emotional response feels really important. So I do often think about that for the reader. But when it's revision, in the way I've been describing, say that story about my father that I've used as an example, but I think this is what I look for in revision generally, that final understanding of my own work. Why did I write this? What does it mean to me? Why did I choose this material? Why did I write it this particular way? I'm not always sure that the reader needs to get that or know that. It's a sense of the completion of the work that is important for me. It seems quite personal in those regards. It's odd because I was just talking to students who are very anxious about the reception of their work, right? And they're worried about, I mean, they have to contend with the reception of their work on social media, which I never had to kind of grapple with when I was coming up. So they're very sensitized to criticism and how the work will be received. And in a way, it doesn't happen with everything I write, but if I brought something to that point where it feels like it's really done, that I fully understand why it is the way it is, and I understand why it has to be this way, that is also a bulwark against criticism. Because my journey with the work has been completed to my satisfaction. And at some level, I whisper this, don't quote me, I don't care what the reader thinks at that point. Certainly not what the critic thinks at that point. And you know, I offer that to writing students as a kind of, that's like the nirvana point, right? You get to that point where you just don't care. But you have to work hard to get there. You have to work to a point where you leave no stone uncovered and you question everything and you arrive at a place where you finally understand this is why it had to be that way. The architecture, I'm going to talk more about the architecture. I was just in Rome last weekend and I mean, not that I know much about Roman history, but the guide was, and they took these marbles from the Colosseum and they took them over there to the Vatican and they made statues out of these blocks of marble. And so that recycling even of products in some ways, or the reshaping of a city, the sightlines in a city. Can you see the Colosseum from the Vatican? Oh no, we're going to put a building in the way to make a political point. Mussolini's place is there and he knocked down all the buildings between his balcony and the Colosseum so he could always be filmed with the Colosseum behind him. Those kind of meanings in buildings, urban planning are fascinating to me, although I'm something of an ignoramus, but I do like those instances of other areas or examples where we can find those revisionary ideas, right? I think I was recently, this is a small tangent, technologists talk about, I was watching Silicon Valley recently during lockdown. There's a line for app developers, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Right? Some of you may have heard. And I think we think of revision as a bug, flaw, but I think where the writing process is concerned, revision is not a bug, it's a feature. Yeah, sorry, there was a hand here as well. Go ahead, please.
I guess 2 parts, a bit more practical.
Thank you.
When you've got your first draft, do you like to let it stew for a bit?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, right.
And also, second, what you mentioned earlier about how you used to like swap manuscripts and comment on each other's work. Do you still let other people in?
I do. Let me answer that first one first. So, you know, I love creative writing workshops. It's one of the reasons I keep teaching them, but I don't share my work in a workshop space anymore. But I think that's partly because I've internalized the voice of various workshops that I've been in, so they're part of my sensibility now, I think, in various ways. Thanks for coming, you guys. But I also should point out that I met my wife in a workshop and married my best reader, basically, and I still give her my stuff. You may recall, many of you will recall that in workshop protocol, often the person who shares the work sits there quietly while everybody else talks about them, which is a bit excruciating sometimes, although I think somewhat useful as well. And I have to admit that we don't observe that protocol in my marriage. So if I share something with my wife, she'll say, what do you mean by that? And but it's very productive to me. The first question was the question of letting it lie, right? Which brings us back to a theme of our conversation today, and I don't mean to keep going too long for everybody. Theme of time, right? We were thinking about it, and we looked at the map, looking at the old photographs of Coventry. I'm taking us back to 1979, thinking about the 40 years between then and now, between that moment with my father and now. All of you to say that time changes our relationship to a work. So that first flood of inspiration that drives us through a first draft is valuable, but it does sometimes feel that it's useful to let that work sit for a while and then come back to it, not with the eyes of the writer who knows what he meant, but having forgotten some of that, and to read it with the eyes of a reader going, what did I mean by that? Why is that like that? The way this manifests itself organically in my work, I don't presume it's true necessarily for yours, but it may be for some other folks as well, you may recognize this, is I write a first draft, and at some point, maybe even before the end of it, I go, oh, this is terrible. This is just horrible. I can't bear to look at this, put it in the drawer. You know, I keep it on the computer, but I can't look at that. And it could be sometimes as late as a year later I'll be working on something else. And whatever that thing I'm working on a year later will arrive at that point, oh my God, this is really terrible. It's even more terrible than that thing I wrote last year. And then I'll go back and look at the thing from last year, and because I'll come back to it having forgotten to some degree what I thought I was doing. I will see new things in it. The skill of revision that I'm describing here, the idea of re-seeing, is very much a shift from the eyes of the writer who thinks he's in control to the eyes of a reader who's trying to interpret their own work, which is essentially what we do for each other in workshop, right? That feeling of I'm looking at somebody else's work, trying to figure out what they mean by it. And that skill can be brought to bear on our own work, I think, in incredibly profitable ways, if we give ourselves that little buffering time, that space of time. The horror, of course, is I'm saying, oh, does every story, every draft have to take a year in between, which seems horrible. But I think, as we know, sharing work with others, sharing work in a workshop accelerates that process, because we hear feedback that comes from others, so we begin to see our own work through their eyes. And I would even suggest that the moment, my mother knows this in her writing group, I'm sure other people know this as well, even the moment when we just hand out our story to the class, you read it for next week, we'll talk about it next week, or hit send on the manuscript, just the moment of letting go of it and knowing that other eyes will be upon it, changes our relationship to it. So that moment we have whenever we hit send or whenever we give a story out to somebody else, that moment shortly afterwards we go, meant to fix that. That's the anticipation of other eyes on the work. And that's the beginning of revision, I think. Yeah? All right. Oh, yeah, please. Maybe should this be the I can go on all day, but I don't want to keep people.
It's 5:20. We've got time.
Oh, great, perfect, great. Please go ahead.
Hopefully just a quick question.
Sure.
Is there, for you or anybody, is a revised manuscript tend to be longer or shorter than original?
That's a very good question. So I gave the example before of the Raymond Carver stories, which are sometimes half as long as they were. We know this because Carver, later in his career, republished versions of some of those stories that were quite a lot longer and really interesting. The famous ones are a pair of stories called The Bath in its short version and A Small Good Thing in its longer version. But there's actually a story called So Much Water, So Close to Home. Same title for both drafts, but both of them one of them is twice as long as the other, I think. And there's a fascinating Australian movie called Jindabyne based on that moves the whole thing to Australia. And there's also an amazing revision of that work. What I think, the distinction I like to make is that when we edit our work, that's not quite the same as revising our work. The editorial energy often feels like tightening work, cutting out the fat, eliminating certain things. So the editorial work often ends up with a slightly contracted draft of the story. And I think there's a place for that, but I think it's quite late in the process. What I tend to notice in my own work, and actually a lot of my students' work, is that their early drafts need to expand, right? That they nearly always can benefit from writing longer second and third drafts, because they need to explore the space a little bit more. They need to elaborate upon certain things in various ways. Sometimes that expansion allows them then to cut back later, but they need to expand it first of all. The argument I would make is Hemingway had a line. He suggests that everything you know about a story you can leave out, right? It's part of the idea of his iceberg theorem, that the bit that shows up above is the surface and there's all this other stuff hidden away underneath. And I like the idea of that. But I think, again, that idea of everything you know about the story you can leave out. But if you have to write the story to know it, you have to write long. You have to allow yourself to do that before you cut away. And if you cut too soon, you're getting ahead of yourself, and you may not have a chance to know all the things you need to know, learn all the things you need to learn about the story. So I have a notion that the revision process, it's like a living thing. Stories breathe out, and eventually they breathe in. And sometimes they do that process, that concertina process, several times along the way. And I like that feeling of going in and out, I think, in various ways. One reason I should say why first drafts tend to be short, right? So for my students in class, there's a very practical reason. They are all writing towards the deadline, so they know, I gotta hand this in tomorrow, and I'll rush. So they rush the endings. Always they rush the endings. They know they're going to do that. And I try to talk them through that, as at least they recognize that that's happening. But I think even separate to a workshop deadline or a class deadline, we rush endings, right? Because as we write our ideas down, we are battling our doubt. That doubt is, will this be a story? Will I finish it? Is it worth anything? And there's a kind of chasm of doubt. We have to get across it. I almost think of it as the image I have in my mind is some cartoon character, Wile E. Coyote, running off a cliff, right? But he keeps his legs churning, and only when he looks down, oh shit, and then he goes down, right? But it may be, just possibly, we could go fast enough to get to the other side. That's the act of faith or will that we engage in as writers. That means we have to get to the end fast, because we're trying to, I want to get to somewhere, I want to get across that chasm as quickly as I can. So first drafts are often rushed, a little schematic, they move too fast. Once we've got that bridge, it might be a very rickety bridge that we've just built across the chasm, then we go, oh yeah, okay, now I've got that. This is a terrible architectural metaphor, Danny. Maybe when I built that, I can now build a better one, or a stronger one, or a wider one, and that's what we can do in a second or a third draft. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of expansion in revision, essentially.
I'm intrigued that you mentioned The Small Good Thing, because I just think that is such a wonderful story. And I'm thinking, I've only read one version as far as I'm aware, so is there an expanded version?
There is an expanded version. It's the one that Carver published, I think, in the late collection, where I'm calling from, the collected works. But there's an earlier one that's quite a bit shorter. One of the things that's interesting about Lish's influence on Carver's work is I think that Lish, I think he tends to elide female agency in the stories. So the wife in A Small Good Thing is stronger in the longer Carver version than in Lish's version. It's more about her than it is about the husband. But if you like that story, watch that movie Jindabyne, because it's fairly amazing. And the idea of relocating that story to Australia feels like it shouldn't work, but it does. And actually, I love that so much that I often suggest to students as a revision exercise to just change the location of a story, radically shift the location, which I've done at least in my own work. I have a story in one of my earlier collections. The American edition has that story set in Oregon, and the British edition has that story set in Liverpool and Manchester. It's almost an act of translation, but it was a really interesting and profitable one for me in that context.
Has everybody asked the questions they'd like to ask? Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter. It's been an absolute inspiration on all sorts of levels listening to your talk. And I have really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that everybody else has as well. So, you know, we got there in the end, and it was really worth the wait. So thank you really very much indeed. Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming, and appreciate the patience. Thank you, Helen, as well. I'm really glad you pursued me to do this.